Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Sine Die Edition of our legislative session rundown series. My name is Nicole Robinson, and I am the political director at Fair Fight Action. Fair Fight Action is a Georgia-based organization that works to protect the freedom to vote in our home state and also across the country. We were founded to organize collective efforts to expose, fight, mitigate, and reverse voter suppression. We do this work through voter education and mobilization, litigation, and legislative advocacy. And so the 2023 Georgia legislative session ended this past Wednesday, and it was 40 hectic days of fighting, debating, and laws being passed that are both an attack on our democracy and an attack on our most vulnerable Georgians. And so during this legislative session, the team here at Fair Fight Action worked side by side with pro-democracy state legislators and advocates in our fight. And tonight, you're all in for a treat because you'll get to hear directly from the advocates who worked tirelessly this legislative session to protect the rights of Georgians. And so we're going to start with introductions from our panelists. They're going to introduce themselves, their organizations, and the work that they do. So we're going to start with Isabel Otero.
I'm the Georgia Policy Director for the SPLC Action Fund. Along with our sister organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center, we work to safeguard the civil and human rights of all people. And we work primarily in the South. We're best known for tracking and monitoring hate groups and extremists, but we do a lot of work through our legal team on voting rights, criminal legal reform, economic justice, children's rights, and all kinds of other stuff. And so I'm happy to talk about all of that work that we did during the legislative session.
And Michaela, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and then Mason, if you could go after her.
Hi, I'm Michaela Arciaga. I am the Georgia Director of Advocacy for IDRA. We are an education policy and research civil rights nonprofit. So we focus exclusively on issues of education equity across the South. The majority of our legislative advocacy work happens in Texas and in Georgia, but we have provided education-related resources and technical assistance across the South and actually across the country. So looking forward to talking about it.
And my name is Mason Goodwin, he, him pronouns, and I'm with the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition. And so we are a movement of students across the state of Georgia who are products of our public education system, fighting for a more like just and equitable education system, and then where all the youth intersection issues occur.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Really happy to have y'all with us this evening. And so we're going to start with the meat of tonight's panel, which will be voting rights. And so I know this is not news to anyone here, but in recent years, anti-voter lawmakers have really doubled down on pushing and passing legislation to reduce voter access. And the 2023 legislative session was no different. So here in Georgia, like in a lot of states, especially southern states and battleground states, big lie election conspiracy theorists remain active. But they also hold elected legislative positions, and that's including key positions in leadership in our state legislature. So this legislative session, Fair Fight Action and the Voting Rights Coalition and progressive organizations in Georgia worked really, really hard to stop the onslaught of anti-voter bills. So I'm just going to highlight a few of y'all tonight before we jump into panelists.
Welcome back.
Okay, super sorry. My computer literally just shut down and it's plugged in and everything. So apologies, but jumping right back in. So us with our Voting Rights Coalition and other progressive groups worked really hard to stop the anti-voter bills that we had this session. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those for folks. And so one bill that we, along with some allied legislators and the Georgia Voting Rights Coalition, were able to defeat was Senate Bill 221. And so what Senate Bill 221 would have done was a lot of really horrible things if it passed. And it was also a bill that was, like I mentioned before, pushed by election denying conspiracy theorists and legislators. And so one of the bad things that this bill would have done was it would have completely banned a complete ban on ballot drop boxes. Another really big piece of this bill is that it would have made mass voter challenges easier, which mass voter challenges are a tactic of voter suppression. So with mass voter challenges are something that we've seen increase over the last few years, where a handful of people will typically get faulty data and evidence, and they will challenge the voter registration of anywhere from 1 to thousands of people at a time. And in their challenge, they're saying, hey, I think these people aren't lawfully registered to vote in the state of Georgia or in this district. They should be removed from the voter rolls. And statistically, a really large portion of these challenged voters are typically from large metro counties, and they also happen to be voters of color primarily. And so one of the main concerns with voter challenges and the fact that Senate Bill 222 and why Verify and other organizations fought so hard against it is because its attempt to make, or 221, apologies, its attempt to make voter challenges easier is not just the fact that it's trying to take away the right to vote of folks. That's obviously a really, really horrible thing, but it also uses up the valuable time and resources of county elections offices because they have to research and hold hearings on these voter challenges. And most of these challenges do end up getting thrown out because, like I mentioned earlier, the people who file them are using faulty data that they're saying is evidence. But thankfully, so along with the Georgia Voting Rights Coalition, other organizations like some on this call, pro-voter Board of Election members, and pro-voter legislators, we were able to stop this bill from passing this legislative session, but fully expect similar attempts to come back up next year. And then another bill I want to highlight that unfortunately did pass is Senate Bill 222. So Senate Bill 222 follows the trend of many and the majority party pushing bills that are designed to rehash the 2020 election. So what Senate Bill 222 does is it criminalizes county workers who seek innovative ways to fund elections. And in criminalizing county workers, this bill threatens them with a felony along with a $10,000 fine and a year in jail. And so, along with criminalizing county workers with a felony, $10,000 fine, a year in jail, Senate Bill 222 is also making it harder for counties to fund elections as the cost to fund elections continues to grow. So, for example, some counties saw the cost to run elections between 2020 and 2022 rise by not just hundreds and thousands of dollars, but literally millions, some counties tens of millions of dollars. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is Senate Bill 202 that passed, which put a lot of unfunded mandates on counties. And there's also the additional cost of those new voting machines that need to be maintained that's fallen on counties as well. And so with all these additional costs being placed on counties, the state does little to nothing to offset the costs for them. And a lot of these points were raised in the debate against Senate Bill 222. We had voting rights advocates, we had election workers, Board of Election members, and legislators all raise these points about why this bill was so harmful. But unfortunately, it did pass the legislature, and it is currently awaiting Kim's signature. It passed along party lines. We are hoping it will be vetoed, but don't have a ton of hope, just given that Brian Kemp is a vote suppressor in chief, and that has been what he has been about his entire political career. And so shifting a little bit, but staying in the realm of voting rights, I want to shift to our panelists. So my first question is for Isabel. So Isabel, SPLC Action Fund and the Georgia Rights Restoration Coalition has been working on their No Taxation Without Representation campaign to restore voting rights to people who have lost those rights due to a felony conviction. So Isabel, would you mind telling us a little bit more about felony disenfranchisement in Georgia and y'all's efforts to repeal it?
Absolutely. So felony disenfranchisement essentially means that the state has taken away your right to vote or limited your right to vote in some way based on your criminal record. And at SPLC, unfortunately, we know this is absolutely a relic of Jim Crow and many other attempts at suppressing the vote, especially from Black and Brown people. And so we believe that everyone should retain their right to vote, criminal record or not. But at the very least in Georgia, what we're working with several of our partners like the Inner City Muslim Action Network, Women on the Rise, and others, Southern Center, trying to, at the very least, restore someone's right to vote as soon as they are out of prison. So you've paid your debt to society, you're out, whether on probation or parole. We think that if you're back in the community, contributing, you're especially paying taxes, you should have your right restored. And we've worked with Senator Josh McLaurin to fix this issue within the Georgia Constitution. So it's not as easy as sort of undoing a bill or a law. This is something that, because it is very much a relic of the Jim Crow era, it was inserted into our state constitution using this language of moral turpitude. And it's been interpreted by the courts as any felony is a felony of moral turpitude. And that has to be changed at the constitutional level, so it requires that we pass a bill and then have voters, affirm that we are wanting to provide people back their right to vote if they are out of prison. And so we've been working with a lot of advocates on this. It's going to be a while, I think, before we get what we want. But at the very least, we're hoping that because this is a biennial session where the bills that were introduced this year continue to be live for next year, we're hoping that at the very least we can get SR 148. That's the Senate resolution that would undo this issue. We're hoping that we can work with Senator McLaurin and get this bill at the very least heard and have the community come out and support us. And one of the things that we can share later on as well is a petition that we have going. This is an issue that in Georgia affects about 250,000 people. Georgia has some of the highest rates of parole and probation and supervision even after someone has been released. And because of the way the laws have been interpreted and because of the way that Georgia enforces them, those people continue to be disenfranchised, even though they are now out in the community contributing members of society. And I think that we're hoping that by the time January rolls around, we can have 250,000 signatures for those 250,000 people. And so we're working with our coalition. If folks want to get involved, they're free to reach out to SPLC Action Fund and some of our other partners on this. But it is something that it's a positive bill. It's something that we want to do to restore people's voting rights because you should be able to elect your representatives whether or not you have a criminal record.
Awesome. Thank you, Isabel. And so now we're just going to jump into some education questions. And so Michaela and Mason, this question is for both of y'all, so feel free to piggyback off of each other. But you both worked tirelessly this session to defeat Senate Bill 233. So that was a bill that would have taken millions of dollars in funding away from public schools in the name of vouchers. And can y'all just give us some more insight into this bill and its harms, how you worked to stop it from passing, and what do people need to know about the bill moving into 2024?
I'm cool with kicking it off. So I think putting the voucher into context, there's a broader movement across the country, et cetera, to privatize education. I think that's where this conversation needs to start, is that this isn't just its own alone situation. We've seen it with for-profit charters. We've seen it with other versions of vouchers. This is a broader movement to move away from our public school system so we can profit off of the education system instead. So this voucher is kind of like the big go at it, and it's a universal voucher that would give $6,500 to put students who are in public schools, higher income students, into private schools instead with that $6,500 voucher. And that was kind of the overarching view. That is widely unpopular because basically the narrative that's being pushed is that our public schools are failing our kids, they're not working, and we need other options. We need parent choice is the broader push from the right-wing groups that are pushing these type of bills. But what we know is most people interact, 90% of students interact with that public education system in the state of Georgia. Most people appreciate what our public education system is doing. And this is kind of go against the existing narrative and eventually lead to that privatization. So this voucher had been introduced before. It had failed in committee last session. And then this session was the first time that it was brought to a vote. It passed through the Senate with an amendment that would basically lock it down to where it's only the bottom 25% of schools that could use this voucher. That ended up passing the Senate, made it over to the House on Sine Die, and we were able to kill the bill then. And I'll give it over to Michaela if you want to kind of.
Yeah, I mean, Mason hit the most important part on the head, that there is just this nationwide coordinated attack against our public education system that is part of this larger attempt to, I think, disenfranchise particularly people of color. But I think what's also important to know about this voucher and similar programs like it is that it's not clear from the authors where this money is going to come from. And without subjecting everyone to a very long lecture about how funding mechanisms for education in Georgia work, The state is not the only source of funding for our local school systems. And so I think that's a really common misconception that we were trying to confront and conversation that we've been trying to have all session. As it stands right now, the state provides funding for individual students based on what's called a weighted formula. And depending on a certain student's attributes, like if they're in kindergarten, if they are in ninth grade, if they are receiving special education services, if they are in a agricultural program, they receive different amounts of dollars from the state. But that does not equate to the number of dollars that are spent in total to educate them. The base weight that was used by the state was, I think for this year, it was just over $3,000. The voucher amount was $6,500. It's still not clear where those dollars are coming from. They're saying that we have enough to give money for the full education system and we have the money for the voucher. And that voucher's not in some way going to take those dollars away from the district. But if I have a kid who I have to enroll, because it is required that they are enrolled for at least 2 attendance periods, that is either a spring fall or a fall spring, then they qualify for funding. They trigger the funding from the state. And so those dollars should go to that local school or that local school district. But if you're following the math kind of like we are, if the state's only giving about $3,000 for kids, and that's all 9th through 12th graders qualify for just that $3,000, that other $3,500 has to come from somewhere. And when you look at the state of funding in our state, and we'll talk about it, I think, a little bit, but we've underfunded our education system for over 20 years. We have a formula that when it was passed in 1985 was incredibly progressive and innovative. But we haven't had a full overhaul of that formula ever. And that is a huge problem because the world and the way we educate our kids is completely different. Our world is different if you just look in the last 5 years, let alone the last 40 years. And something they've started saying is that like we're funding the formula, which is true. But again, the formula hasn't been fully updated in almost 40 years. So there are huge gaps in the way that we fund education. And this bill would, again, just send money to private schools. And I think one of the ways that we really focused on advocating around this bill and against this bill was focusing on who it would harm the most. And who it would harm the most is, one, our kids living in poverty and attending schools that serve a majority of kids living in poverty. And two, our rural districts. Our rural districts are much less likely to have a private school. There's a couple of really great resources that were provided to map out where the private schools are in our state. They are highly clustered in our metro areas. There's a majority of our rural districts that have no private schools whatsoever, meaning that if those dollars go with a child to a private school from their public district, those dollars are leaving that district for good. And that, I think, is what resonated with a lot of our representatives, both Republican and Democrat, especially in those rural areas. Our school systems, and for many of them, those school systems could be the largest employer, the largest budget holder, the center of communities for a lot of our districts. You're sending money away from those community institutions, and that just doesn't resonate with most people.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And just for folks' awareness, the bill could come back up in 2024, right? Just want to make sure people have their eyes and ears.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. I don't want anybody to like rest on their laurels that this is done, we won't see it again. I think, like Mason did a really good job of highlighting, this is happening all over the country. Georgia was actually kind of unique in that ours did not move forward. But we do also have 2 other voucher programs already operating in the state, which I wouldn't want to underestimate in how the role that they played to obstruct this one. So this could come back. Absolutely. It will be sent. It's all been recommitted to committee, but it would need to be heard again, which would give people the chance to speak on it again, hopefully.
Cool. Thank you, guys, both for that. And then another question for y'all, and this is on a more positive bill. So this session we had Senate Bill 284, which was introduced by a friend to all of us, State Senator Jason Estevez. And so this bill did not pass, but it is still technically alive for next session. So can you tell us a little bit about this bill, the benefits of it, and what people can do to help increase the chances that it moves through the legislative process next year?
Yeah, so what's the bill number? 284 is basically Michaela highlighted that we have an outdated funding mechanism. So currently we fund with the QBE formula. That breaks it down by how Michaela stated with all the students, base amount, and then it also has weights. And those weights are supposed to adjust for different outcomes. So like special learning, equalization, which is supposed to make up difference in funding between that like local share that you use for funding of education. So essentially what the bill does is it's our alternative to what the voucher is trying to do. It's actually directly investing in those schools with students living in poverty, giving them that funding that they can't make up for in the local share, and they need that additional state funding. So we're calling it the opportunity weight, and essentially what it does is it puts targeting funding in districts with students living in poverty. So in our metro districts, it would make up that funding. Like if we looked at Gwinnett and we took like North Gwinnett and South Gwinnett, so like Meadow Creek and like North Cross, it would make up that funding, where North Cross is getting a ton more funding because it has increased local shares that they're putting more funding in it because it's higher income students, compared to like Meadow Creek where it's lower income students. The QBE weight that we want, that bill, would put direct funding into a school like Meadow Creek. But what it also does is our metro counties can pull a lot more tax revenue because they're local, because like houses are more expensive, et cetera, property values are higher. But then our rural counties, they're all left behind because they don't have that same local share to pull from. So what the opportunity weights is, it gives them rural counties funding. So like this is a really popular bill that would do a lot of good across the aisle. And hopefully we can push that and use that as an alternative to the voucher program. And Michaela, if you want to touch
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that has been in years in the making. We have had a bill that would try to provide additional funding for educating students who are living in poverty for years. What's unique about this one is that it doesn't leverage grant funding. It's actually a dedicated weight, meaning that it is recession proof. It means that schools get money every year, regardless of the budget appropriations. That value may fluctuate, but every year systems who are serving kids living in poverty will receive dedicated funding. And the reason why this is such a crucial policy investment is that we know that poverty manifests in different ways, and it looks different in every district, every school. We have right now 60% of our schools or 60% of our kids are qualifying for free and reduced lunch. This would touch a majority of schools in our state. And it would give the flexibility to schools who are already trying to fill those gaps with specialized programming and specialized instructors, additional personnel. It would just give them a little bit more resources to be able to provide the targeted intervention that so many kids deserve, regardless of their zip code, regardless of how much money their parents make, what neighborhood they live in. This would help kind of even the playing field across districts and in every school. So we're really excited about it. There's a couple of ways to get involved besides, I think, like the traditional ways. There's a funding coalition, Fund Georgia's Future, has done a ton of work coordinating around this issue. I would also just say, I think awareness is probably one of the biggest obstacles. If you can tell one or two friends that this bill exists and then have all three of you and that expand out, contact your legislators and say that this is so needed. I think that's one of the biggest ways to help move something like this forward, showing that this benefits every kid, not just kids of color or white kids or rich kids. It will serve every district and touch every school building. I think that is one of the best ways to invest your time and energy, is just make sure that your friends and your representatives know that this bill exists and that you want it.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And I'll say Easter's coming up, Easter dinner with the family. It's a great time to bring up Senate Bill 284. Thanks, guys. And so pivoting to criminal justice reform. So Isabel, this question is for you. So we know that over the last few years, those in power in this state have really doubled down on their really harmful, tough on crime policies. And so can you tell us a little bit about some of the most egregious bills you and other criminal justice reform advocates have fought this year?
Absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, yeah, we have seen this trend, fear and going after people who are experiencing poverty seems to be a trend, unfortunately, for the Republican Party these days. And so we've seen a sort of dismantling of a lot of the progress that had happened under the last gubernatorial administration in Georgia, where we did see some real criminal legal reform. And so this year we've seen a lot of sort of like old failed policies just rearing their heads again. Enhanced penalties, mandatory minimums, bail reform. That's not really bail reform. That's just going to keep people in jail. A lot of these bills, that was the theme, right? It was, we're tough on crime. We don't really care what it is that happened or why somebody might have missed a court date. We're just going to keep them in jail indefinitely. And so, you know, these bills were things like the governor's own gang bill, which it did improve as the session went along, but it was essentially, you know, designed to keep people in jail longer if they could not buy their freedom for a variety of different offenses. There was a gang bill that is, rather than targeting the reasons why someone might find themselves involved in gang activity, it just punishes people and gets them out of their community. It takes them out of the community for longer. It makes it harder for them if they are experiencing poverty to get out of the criminal legal system. And so it's been a pattern that we have been seeing. And we saw everything from gang bills to protest bills that would make it harder for people to go out and express their First Amendment right to protest. Right now in Tennessee, we're seeing what's happening at that state legislature. If some of the bills that were introduced in this session would have passed, we might have had a bunch of kids with felonies all of a sudden because they were protesting in a way that Republicans dislike. And so there's a lot of things that did not pass, but the governor's gang bill did pass. There's a school safety bill. That's another bill that sort of starts to blur the lines between whether we're actually doing public safety and criminal legal reform and just roping teachers into monitoring behavior of their students and not actually being able to provide any support for them. And so there were several things like that happened that unfortunately are part of this trend. And part of these bills also include things that take away the discretion of law enforcement and district attorneys and local officials to use their resources as they see fit. And that is another very troubling trend that we've seen that we are hoping to continue to fight, but it's something that people should pay very close attention to, right? That some of these things are not in the name of public safety. They're in the name of undoing your will as a voter for the people that you put in place to deal with criminal legal issues or with jails or any other part of the system in your local community. And so it's very disheartening. We would much rather see investments in communities, resources, housing, things that would lift people out of poverty and sort of interrupt the reasons why someone might find themselves having to deal with criminal activity and not have to continuously have to sort of buy their freedom from the state of Georgia at every turn.
Thank you, Isabel. And another question for you. So another harmful bill we saw, and kind of an additional part of this tough on crime policy, as opposed to getting to the root cause of problems, was a bill that attacks unhoused people or people who don't have stable housing. So can you talk a little bit about this effort this session to further criminalize unhoused people and the impact that these efforts have on these vulnerable populations and local governments?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, in the state of Georgia, any given day, you may have at least 10,000 people that may be homeless. The housing crisis was exacerbated by the pandemic. A lot of that has not been undone over the last couple of years. And so last year, the Georgia Senate decided to study the issue of homelessness, try to figure out what are ways that we can actually start to solve this problem. They came up with some relatively good recommendations for a government study committee. I was pretty happy to see a lot of what they put on there. Problem is that the bill that they ended up passing does absolutely no. I think it does one of the things, which is reviews the programs that help people who are experiencing homelessness. That is a very small thing that in no way provides funding for these organizations or helps communities actually do what they need to do to get people out of homelessness. And so what the bill does do, so this is Senate Bill 62, it essentially forces enforcement of camping bans and other local ordinances, but it does it in a way that, again, takes away the discretion of law enforcement and district attorneys and sheriffs and others in those communities to decide how best to deal with someone who might be unsheltered. And so if you're experiencing homelessness, now this bill allows a regular person, it doesn't have to be someone in law enforcement or some official, to sort of sue or go after your community for lack of enforcement. It allows the Attorney General to go after these communities for lack of enforcement of camping bans and other things. And camping bans, you know, this is the type of bill that where you start to see the very unconstitutionality of these things, where you are criminalizing behavior that saves your life or that like sustains your life, like sleeping. And it's very troubling to see, right? And so the alternative for a lot of these communities is going to be either you grab folks who are experiencing homelessness, get them out of wherever it is that they have their things, take away their liberty, put them in jail for a long extended period of time, especially because we've passed all these other bail bills that are going to make these things worse, or you risk being sued by the state or by somebody else. And so it puts these local communities in a really tough position to either force them to, and it is exactly like that by design, right? It's going to force enforcement or force people to unfortunately be put in worse situations. If you cannot afford a place to live, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to afford a $10,000 bond to get out for trespassing or something else. And so it's a really, it exacerbates a lot of these issues that are already bad in certain communities, like larger metro areas. And it continues to chip away at the local control that these communities have to actually deal with these problems. So rather than providing funding and support, the state is doing things that are very counterproductive and not following its own committee study and report on how to deal with homelessness.
Thank you, Isabel. And another question for you. So the attack on criminal justice reform and vulnerable populations isn't just about gangs and bail and people who are experiencing homelessness. It also includes targeting pro-criminal justice reform district attorneys. And so we've seen this actually happening all across the country. It is this very coordinated and well-funded right-wing push, an effort to undo the will of voters and to remove duly elected district attorneys from office. So can you talk a little bit about these efforts in Georgia?
Yeah, so the state of Georgia, you know, in the last election, there was a historic, you know, number of district attorneys, a lot of them women of color, who ran on very clearly a justice reform platform, right? They were not going to go after people for drug-related crimes. They were going to work with communities to deal with these issues in other ways. They were very clear with voters, and voters said, yep, let's do that, because what we've been doing is not working. And as soon as those women and those folks got into office, all of a sudden it became a crisis, right? All of a sudden it was, oh no, we now people aren't enforcing the laws, and all of these like hyperbolic sort of stories start to come out from the Republicans about ways in which, you know, somehow laws aren't being enforced in some of these places. These are still district attorneys. They are still enforcing the laws. They are still having to deal with criminal activity and actually, you know, find justice and accountability for people who are doing these things. The problem right here is that this is a very clear and concerted effort, like you said, on our democratic values, right? This is a state legislature with elected officials from across the state saying to very specific metro areas, especially, we don't agree with your voters. We don't think that you pick the right people, and we don't like the way they're enforcing the law and using their discretion. And so we're just going to get rid of them. And that is a incredibly dangerous dismantling of our criminal justice system. we are seeing, if what we're hoping for is accountability, one of the main ways that we hold our elected officials accountable is by voting them in or out of office. And this is the kind of thing that absolutely undoes the will of the voters. It will overturn elections, essentially, right? And that is a very, very dangerous pattern that we've seen. We're seeing this in Florida, Texas, Mississippi, Pennsylvania. These are bills like SB 92 is the bill that passed. There's another bill that's still out there that could come back next year, and they could continue this trend. But there are plenty of ways to hold district attorneys accountable already. This is not necessary, right? These commissions for sort of how to overthrow district attorneys that were duly elected by voters in their district is not necessary. There are plenty of other ways in which lawmakers or voters are able to get rid of their district attorneys if they don't like what they're doing. And so, there's misconduct issues that can be addressed. There's elections, there's procedures at the State Bar of Georgia. There's all kinds of things that are available already for people, including elections, right? And so if we don't like our elected officials, we vote them out. They work for us. And this is a very, very scary trend. I think people need to pay very close attention to these things. And as this bill becomes, it's very likely it's something that the governor supported. We expect him to sign it. And we are expecting that as they continue this trend, we need people to push back, right? We need voters those legislators who are doing this, we need those people to be held accountable for sort of undoing and going after voters' decisions in this way, because it's very, very dangerous, very anti-democratic.
Yes, thank you, Isabel. And kind of going back to you mentioning what's happening in Tennessee right now, where they're expelling duly elected state legislators. Again, like that's it's not the same, but it's just another example of this nationwide push because you can't win the election fairly, finding different ways to undo the will of voters and to weaken our democracy. So thank you for giving us an explainer on that. And so now we're going to pivot a little bit. And so this is actually an issue that all of y'all worked on and are experts on. And so I will let whoever wants to answer the question, or all of y'all can jump in if you'd like. And so this year alone, we've had over 450 bills that have been introduced across the country attacking the rights of trans people and trans kids. And so this is a very concerning and dangerous trend that has been developing for years, but the efforts of these anti-trans groups have really, really ramped up this year. And their efforts were on full display here in Georgia this past legislative session. So can y'all tell us a little bit about Senate Bill 88, which thankfully did not pass this session?
Yeah, I can get started. I think what's important to understand is that right-wing groups secured Roe v. Wade, overturned it, and then secured anti-abortion laws across the country. So they kind of needed what's this new thing to keep their funders happy and keep these right-wing groups going. And they decided to start attacking queer children, was essentially the result of that decision. So our SB 88 is our Don't Say Gay bill, so the one that got a ton of attention in Florida. This is basically our version of that bill. We saw it last year, it died. Got brought up again this year. It didn't have a lot of push, but we mostly because they had other priorities. So it did die in committee, and we'll have to deal with it next year. Essentially what the bill would do is it kind of targets our education system. So we talked about the voucher, where that's kind of like reallocating money towards private education. This is how do we start clamping down on the public education system to attack it, essentially, make it divisive, demonize teachers, et cetera, whatever they can do to go after the public education system. This is that bill. Kind of for a little bit more context, last year we saw HB 1084, which are divisive concepts, which attacked how we can teach Black history in schools. This is focused on basically queer topics and that version of the bill. Yeah.
Can I add just a little bit of context too to why that bill was killed? This is, I think what Mason said was spot on. The only other thing I would say is that there is a very coordinated coalition of people that includes some far right faith-based groups, and something that they've been very particular about codifying, like the impact. And Isabel has hinted on this when it came to some of the criminal justice stuff. But when you codify things, it makes it much harder to undo them, right? And so there has been this attempt to misdefine or improperly define and conflate definitions of things like biological sex, gender identity, and they have attempted to do this repeatedly. What ended up happening with SB 88 as well is that it was remarkably improved on. The bill that we got was that we started with was very different from what we ended with. Still terrible, but it had much clearer definitions for things, including a definition for gender identity. And this is something that the people who are against that movement and this movement do not want to see enshrined in state law. And so that is actually what we saw happen, is that the definition for gender identity was included into the newer version of that bill. And that was not something they wanted. They did not want to codify that gender identity is different from sexual orientation or from biological sex. So, and there was some misconflation of that in the beginning of the bill, which is something that we wanted to clarify, like sexual orientation does not equal gender identity, does not equal biological sex. And so with clarifying that definition, it almost killed that bill in a kind of surprising way, but more sinister way than it almost feels.
Yeah. Codifying people's identities and making it clear that these people exist would open it up for lawyers that work with all of us to be like, so these are people then. So you have to treat them like people. You cannot just trample over their civil rights. Sorry. Right. And so that was the fear. It was one of the weirder moments of this legislative session.
Yeah, and there were quite a few strange ones. Both strangely good, strangely bad. And so this question is for you, Isabel. But again, I know everybody's worked on this issue and very knowledgeable about it, so feel free to jump in. But Senate Bill 88 was not the only anti-trans bill introduced in Georgia this session. And unfortunately, there was an anti-trans bill that did pass, and it was signed into law almost immediately after it passed. And so that was Senate Bill 140. So Isabel, can you tell us a little bit about this bill, why it's concerning and harmful, and give folks a little bit of hope, I guess, about kind of what organizations like yours, what kind of steps are being considered to protect trans kids?
Absolutely. So Senate Bill 140 was one of the most heartbreaking things that I've had to deal with at the Capitol in the last few years. This is a bill that is essentially a trans medical ban, right? It prohibits certain types of gender affirming care for being provided to youth. And it is essentially a bill that was written by disinformation, right? So a lot of the things that ended up in the bill as the reasons and rationale for these things are things that just are not scientifically sound. They are not the kind of things that medical associations like the American Pediatrics Association and all kinds of other medical associations have come to understand as life-saving care for genderqueer youth and trans youth. And it is incredibly frustrating, right? That the kind of expertise and all of a sudden the people that were being brought in to talk about these bills were people that have been deemed by courts as to not be experts in their field. And these are not medically sound bills. These are not bills about protecting children. These are bills about vilifying and sort of just throwing red meat at your political base. And it is very, very, very scary because these are bills that have immediate and direct impacts on the lives of kids who need this life-saving care. One of the really harmful things within this bill, other than it taking away the rights of children and parents to make their decisions with their medical doctors, which is a horrible slippery slope that none of us should be on, it also prevents and prohibits hormone replacement therapy from being provided to young children. And so, there's a point in your life when you're young where you don't need hormone replacement therapy, but in order for you to continue to develop, something like a puberty blocker or something like that is not going to be something that's a permanent solution, because you do have to develop. You are growing up. You are going through puberty and other changes, and that would need to, and require medical intervention. Those are the kind of things that are prohibited under this bill, and are very, very dangerous, right? Because there are kids who might very well take their lives into their own hands if they are unable to live their true selves, and live a life with dignity and allow their parents to help them through this process. There was so much misinformation and disinformation used around this, about how people, make these decisions, how easy it is to just like change your mind about these things. Like it was incredibly heartbreaking and harmful conversation that we were having as a state. And unfortunately it did pass very narrowly, but it did pass. And it is something that I think organizations like ours, like human rights, organizations, ACLU of Georgia, others are now sort of passing the baton from our policy teams to our legal teams, to look into, suing and challenging these bills, because these are unconstitutional measures. These are things that we have a right to privacy. We have a constitutional right to be treated under the law fairly and equally like everyone else. And these are things that are very, very clearly discriminatory laws that are being passed by the Georgia legislature. And so we're hoping that, there's the next phase of this, right, helps us undo the harm that's been started by these bills. But and if there's anyone that would like to talk about this, if you have a child that is transgender youth, you have questions, concerns, please reach out to our organizations. We do want to talk to parents and young people about this. It's a really, really harmful bill that unfortunately did pass, and we're now trying to go to the next step to undo the harm.
Just want to see if anyone else wanted to add anything on SB 140. Okay, cool. And so we're just going to move on to our final question for the evening. And this question is for everyone. And so the fight to protect the rights of Georgians, and especially our most vulnerable Georgians, and progressive values is a year-round fight, right? It's year after year. It's been going on for a very long time before each of us. It'll continue after each of us. And so now that the 2023 legislative session is over and the work isn't, what do you want people to know about how they can join you in the fight to protect Georgians' access to voting and human rights, criminal justice reform, and education? I think I'll start with Michaela.
I think so. I have such a specific niche here. Like Isabel and Mason do a lot more of this work than I do, but I think one of the most important things is just to know what's going on, and not just at the state level, because I do think that is a really, it's a lot. If you heard all of the things that we're tracking, it is a lot, but I think it's really important also to know what's happening in your own community. Know where candidates stand on things, especially your local electeds. We didn't talk about this, but we saw a huge coordinated effort to take over local school boards, and those are where so many of the day-to-day decisions about our kids and our schools are being made. It's how money is being spent. So when we talk about like failing schools and mismanagement of funds, our school board needs to be one of the first places that we look. So I think knowing who your local elected people are, knowing the policies at your own local school, and using your voice to speak up when things are not right are huge. There's a lot of coalitions that we all operate with. I'm happy to share the links for, and we are always happy to have new people in. But I think one of the biggest ways I'm seeing change happening is from people who are in their local communities standing up and finding more people who believe that, like they do, that this is not right and that justice should prevail for every kid and every person, and not just a select few.
Thank you, Michaela. And Mason, do you mind going next?
Yeah, I think that was spot on. I think what we need to do is understand how much our local municipalities actually affect what happens statewide. So one thing we didn't talk about with the voucher as well is the reason that voucher died, and the reason we had such an advantage talking to some of these lawmakers is their superintendents were telling them, no, this is going to hurt your public school system. We're your biggest employer. You need to listen to us and not pass this voucher. So just leveraging that local power to create state power is really important. But also, like, if we want to end the school to prison pipeline in the state of Georgia, let's start with Gwinnett, and then let's continue that through all these local counties and then build power into the state level. Same thing can be done with criminal justice reform, like we saw, or criminal legal reform, like we saw that with the Atlanta Detention Center being repurposed with Atlanta and with Grady Health Care. Like, we see these little wins that we can start using for like broader statewide advocacy, and that's really where we need to get involved, is on the local level.
Yeah, I would echo my colleagues here and say get involved. Now that legislative session is over, legislators are back in their counties. They're back in their hometowns. They're back doing whatever it is they're supposed to be doing. And we need to go talk to them. We need to go talk to them. We need to hold them accountable for the decisions that they made. Sometimes they get away with a lot at the state legislature because no one's paying attention, or because we're not paying enough attention to what it is that they're doing. There are municipal elections in parts of the state this year. It's important for people to keep track of those because, as Michaela and Mason have said, local government is affecting you a lot more probably than sometimes even state and federal government issues are, because those are they're making decisions that are immediately affecting your day-to-day lives. We need to get involved. I think that the other thing that I would say is, it is a lot. It is hard. We've been through many different, what feels like lifetimes worth of problems in the last few years. And it is hard not to feel a little bit hopeless and a little bit like, I want to look away. I want to go do something else. Find that thing that you're most passionate about and go figure out who's working on that and join them. You don't have to work on all the things like all of us here. You can just do education or just do the LGBT rights thing, or like whatever it is. There's probably somebody already working on this in your community, and they probably need help. And that would be my sort of advice, right? To just like hone in on something that means a lot to you and work on that with your community, because we did have some wins. I mean, stopping a huge voucher bill with the kind of backing and national money and push and pressure that these Republicans were feeling, that is a huge win. Stopping the Don't Say Gay bill that has been sweeping the nation, huge win. Like, there were some really big things that were able to happen, but that's because we got a bunch of people calling, badgering their legislators, holding them accountable. And that's our job, right? And it's not over, right? So now that they're back in your hometown, they're a lot closer to you. Go talk to them. Go figure out what it is that they have as their priorities for next year, and try to talk them into doing something that would be productive. We would love that.
Oh, thank you guys. And if I can just piggyback on kind of what everybody said, right? So on this whole, find people who are working on something you're interested in. Everybody who's watching this, you're interested in at least one of these issues we talked about. So keeping up with the organizations who are here today. So it's IDRA, SPLC Action Fund, Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, of course, Fair Fight Action is a really, really great step, because we will tell y'all what we need. We will tell y'all what's going on. So please be sure to do that. And I do want to thank each of our panelists for joining us tonight. And I want to thank each of you for the incredible work that y'all do. And I want to thank folks who joined us. And we hope that this panel was informative and interesting. And I hope everybody has a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.